But before that, let's take a look at the latest when it comes to cladding on buildings, which is something we've been talking about for a while now here on BBC Essex as well. And the question on this is, should the new rules of cladding apply to smaller buildings as well as taller ones? Now, this is because government ministers have unveiled that by the end of 2029, all buildings that are over 59 feet, which is about 18 metres, with unsafe cladding should be removed. Now, I had to double check this because I wasn't too sure how big 18 metres was. Roughly about, we're looking at a 5-6 storey building for 18 metres there. So that gives you a little bit of perspective. Building owners who fail to remove dangerous cladding by then have been warned they could face jail, as ministers are urged to act quickly to prevent another Grenfell. Now, on top of this, buildings over 36 feet, which is about 11 metres tall, so significantly shorter there, if they have unsafe cladding, they will either have to be remediated or have a date for completion, with landlords liable for tough penalties if they fail to comply. So again, 11 metres, significantly shorter and more in line with a lot of the buildings we see across our county. Now, Jennifer Viccars is a director of the residence management company at Morello Quarter in Basildon, which is a building that remained trapped in the building safety crisis, and is joining us on the programme today. Good morning, Jennifer. How's it going?
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
No, lovely to have you here.
So for us, I've obviously talked about Morello a lot on this show. Morello Quarter is a huge development. Interesting to hear you talking about sizing there. Morello is massive. It's 426 flats carved up into 3 blocks, 3 of which are over the 18 metres and 1 of which is actually under the 18 metres. So this arbitrary height restriction and set of parameters that's been floated for many years now about what's over and what's under 18 metres has always been a bit of a challenge for us, because 3 of our buildings are over 18 and 1's just under, but that doesn't in any way change the risk or the situation for people who live next door to each other, but one in a slightly shorter block.
I think it's important to mention that because, of course, we actually were having this conversation this morning with producers Adam and myself. How many over 18 metre buildings do we have in the county? Turns out we do have a few, but as you said, when you've got something just below the threshold, it almost feels quite arbitrary, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, I totally agree. And obviously, this has already been going on for many years. Grenfell was in 2017. We're now almost into 2025. So lots of this circling around how do we treat buildings over 18 metres, how do we treat them under 18 metres is like you say, it's arbitrary and irrelevant. What we need to do is take some action on all of the buildings and not be in the situation where we are at Morello, where we have had no action in nearly 8 years to start to put some of these buildings right when they're made of the same materials that killed hundreds of people in Grenfell 8 years ago.
I mean, as you said, Jennifer, you've been quite vocal about this. How are you feeling about the fact that your building is still not sorted?
I think this situation just gets increasingly more desperate with every month and every year that goes by. And I think what we're starting to see as well, that adds to all of the difficulties that I've already, talked about, and appreciate you giving the chance to highlight on this show, is that there is now industries of people profiting out of our misfortune. Every time there's a new fire safety certificate required or a new assessment required, an engineering firm is able to come and charge a huge amount for that. The insurance industry is making absolutely millions out of people like us who have no option but to choose, we don't have a choice, but to buy incredibly expensive premiums from probably one or a consortium of providers that will insure the building and spread the risk between them. Now, insurance used to be a couple of £100 a year for a one-bedroom flat. Now it's close to £2,000 a year. That isn't even what you'd pay to insure some of the biggest mansions in Essex for buildings insurance, let alone all the other costs that now come with being a building that is so dangerous and rated so badly on the safety scales.
Can we talk a little bit more about that, Jennifer, if you may? Because you mentioned some of the things there that have already come in, some of the safety precautions that have already been put in. How much have you invested to make the building safe?
Oh, my goodness. So if I go right back to when the government had the initial reaction to Grenfell and started requiring every building of a certain size, again, some arbitrary sizing and measures floated around, have these external wall safety surveys done. And this is like back in 2018, 2019. That was about £50,000. We then had to install a communal alarm, and that was nearly £300,000. We were given an enforcement notice for a waking watch, which was going to be £56,000 a month. and that was back in 2020. So if we hadn't have been able to organise a way to manage that more sensibly, we would be, we'd be in £500,000 worth of waking watch costs by now, plus all the additional certificates and assessments and safety measures that we're now kind of mandated and obliged to have, which seem to cost kind of £20,000-30,000 a time, regardless of how little or how quick it is to do. So probably you're talking about an exposure of over £1 million, let alone the hideous increases in insurance that every single kind of flat owner or resident is paying as well. So this is a problem that goes into the millions of pounds on top of homes that we believed were good value, well designed, built safely, and were going to be good investments for the future. And in fact, all they've done actually is kind of bankrupt and emotionally cripple most of the people that live here.
Gosh, and you mentioned a number of different initiatives there that you've had to look through as well. Have you found any of them have made a difference so far, Jennifer?
I mean, I think the support of the local fire brigade is useful. Essex Fire and Rescue Service spend time at our building, and they do help us understand the risks and help us navigate what we've got, which is a building that is the lowest rating on the external wall safety scale, that doesn't meet PAS 9980 standards, and is ultimately a very dangerous place to live. It carries the badge, whether we like to talk about it or not, it carries the badge high risk to life. We've been living somewhere for 8 years that has the badge high risk to life. So I appreciate the support in trying to do the best we can, but this building needs to be mitigated. It needs to be fixed, and not just fixed with a few kind of temporary corner cutting measures, but properly fixed in terms of taking off all of the combustible materials and replacing them with non-combustible solutions that will last not just 1 or 2 years, but the next 20, 50 years that this building was obviously supposed to last.
And let's look at these new rules before I let you go then, Jennifer. So buildings over 18 metres tall with cladding should be removed by 2029. Any owners who fail to do this could end up in jail. And any buildings up to the 11 metre threshold with unsafe cladding, they'll either have to be remediated or have a date of completion, which landlords will be liable for tough penalties if they fail to comply. So is this putting more pressure on you and people like you? How is this affecting you specifically?
This is nowhere near good enough, because it's already been coming up for 8 years. So to hear something about 2029, it's just far too far in the future. We are completely paralysed. We can't remortgage. We can't sell. We can't, in some cases, even rent out these properties if people want to move on. We've got divorced people living together. We've got people with multiple kids in one-bedroom flats because their whole lives are on hold because their home situation is crippling their ability to move on, to take new jobs, to move to new places, to do new things. And it's already been 8 years too long. And we can't even comprehend it taking this long until 2029 to put this right.
Jennifer, thanks ever so much for having a chat with us. We have asked for a statement from Western Homes, but they have yet to reply. We have also asked Essex and Fire Rescue how many buildings in the county are still at risk, but we have yet to hear back from them as well. We will be chatting to Conservative MP for Harwich and North Essex, Sir Bernard Jenkin, who was in the Commons last night chatting about cladding at 10:45. So we will have more on this during the programme. We've been talking about cladding on the programme today. Should the new rules of cladding apply to smaller buildings as well as taller ones? This is because government ministers have unveiled that by the end of 2029, all buildings that are over 18 metres with unsafe cladding should be removed. Building owners who fail to remove dangerous cladding by then have been warned they could face jail, as ministers are urged to act quickly to prevent another Grenfell. Also, buildings over 11 metres tall with unsafe cladding will either have to be remediated or have a date for completion, with landlords liable for tough penalties if they fail to comply. Now, Sir Bernard Jenkin is the Conservative MP for Harwich and North Essex, who was in the House of Commons debating about cladding last night. And Sir Bernard, I always imagine House of Commons debates to be like Prime Minister's questions, but it's probably not, is it?
No, there weren't a huge number of colleagues in the House of Commons yesterday, but nevertheless, this is a very important topic. And there were a lot of people in the gallery who were relatives of those who died in Grenfell or were victims themselves, had been in the fire. So it was a very serious debate. And I was pleased that the government announced measures to try and speed this up. But the biggest problem there is the capacity of industry and of building inspectors to get all this work done. So I'm convinced that, for public confidence, they need to concentrate on the high-rise buildings, but also to try and make sure that people's property values aren't damaged and they haven't got very high insurance claims, insurance costs, where the wrong cladding still exists on people's buildings.
Well, that is something we have been talking about on the programme today, Sir Bernard. In fact, have a listen to what Jennifer Viccars had to say. She's the director of the residence management company at Morello Quarter in Basildon.
This has already been going on for many years. Grenfell was in 2017. We're now almost into 2025. So lots of this circling around how do we treat buildings over 18 metres, how do we treat them under 18 metres is like you say, it's arbitrary and irrelevant. What we need to do is take some action on all of the buildings and not be in the situation where we are at Morello, where we have had no action in nearly 8 years to start to put some of these buildings right when they're made of the same materials that killed hundreds of people in Grenfell 8 years ago.
What's your reaction to what Jennifer has to say?
Well, I'm just, I'm so sorry that there are so many people in her position and suffering as a consequence. I mean, it's not nearly as bad as dying in a fire, but it's very serious for people's finances and for people's sense of safety. What I was explaining in the debate yesterday is that even though we've had a very long public inquiry into Grenfell, which cost 100 and something million pounds and took 6 years, it still hasn't come up with a proper safety system for managing the safety of buildings. So I'm afraid what's going to happen is a lot of buildings are going to have work done on them when they're probably perfectly safe. At the same time, we're still catching up with one or two buildings that are not safe. And what we need is a better safety system for assessing and managing risk and quantifying risk. And I was proposing in particular that there should be an independent investigation body like we have in aviation, where everybody has very strong confidence in the safety of aviation because there is an independent investigation body that learns lessons and implements them from every incident. And that's what we need in building safety.
What about the timings of that, though? Because going back to what Jennifer said, Grenfell was 2017. The latest deadline is now 2029. That's well over a decade long. Is it too long? Should stricter restrictions be put in place to avoid another Grenfell sooner?
Well, I think what will avoid another Grenfell is having a proper safety management system. And we've got lots of bodies doing safety around building management. There's a new building safety regulator that's part of the health and safety executive, for example. But there's no apex to the system, and that's where you need an independent investigation body. And then we could accelerate the buildings that really need to be accelerated while looking at other buildings which may have the wrong cladding on, but because of the way the cladding has been fitted, it's probably perfectly safe. Now, I'm not an expert. But what was absolutely clear about the Grenfell situation was there was this air gap between the cladding and the wall that went all the way up the building that acted as a chimney and funneled the fire right up the building. Well, if cladding's been put on without an air gap or with barriers to block the air gap, then it's obviously not nearly so dangerous.
So what is stopping this from happening sooner rather than later? Why is the deadline 2029? Sorry, 2029.
Well, I would say there are two reasons, and I'm being very honest here. One is that there's been a kind of reaction that is very understandable, but anybody is saying, if any of this cladding is on my building, it can't be safe, and therefore get it off. So that includes a very large number of buildings. And the second thing is that there aren't enough skilled builders and skilled people to change all this cladding all at one time, or there isn't enough supply in the market to change all this cladding, and there aren't enough building inspectors to do the inspections to make sure that the new work is safe all at one time. So if one could find a way of cutting down what is urgent, what are the most dangerous buildings? Not every building with the wrong cladding on is dangerous. What are the most dangerous buildings that should be addressed? And what could be said? What could safety experts do to reassure people with the wrong cladding on their building that actually your building is perfectly safe, though in an ideal world you wouldn't have this cladding on. That's what I would do. And I've got a meeting with the Minister for Housing and for the Grenfell response later this week. And I'm taking with me a bunch of experts, including a former Labour minister who was Housing Minister and Fire Minister, the former Chief Investigator of the Aviation Accidents, the Air Accidents Investigation Branch at the Department of Transport, who's very skilled at understanding safety systems, and a very, very senior building inspector. And we're going to have a meeting with the Minister and we'll be discussing all this.
Well, thank you very much, Sir Bernard Jenkin there, Conservative MP for Harwich and North Essex. If you are a builder listening, how do you feel about the deadline? Is it too much pressure? Is Sir Bernard right? Do you need more resources? Call me. Well, we have had a statement from Western Homes, and they say Western Homes is committed to carrying out and covering the cost for the required remedial work at Morello Quarter, Cherrydown East, to deliver the standard of safety required by the Building Safety Pledge. To comply with the newly revised rules issued by the Building Safety Regulator, BSR, in April 2024, a detailed application was submitted this summer for their approval as required. Western Homes cannot commence the works until the BSR's approval is received, and frustratingly has recently been notified of an extension in the forecast date for the BSR's decision from November 2024 to January 2025. Western Homes will be available to get started following the approval from the BSR. So that is a statement from Western Homes.